Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I think what two people said that they're gonna be here in a few minutes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll just like I don't know, we'll wait till they show up. I mean, they said they're coming, so. So is it only us four again? Right? Do we have five?
I think
Do we have
isn't Jared in our group?
yeah,
Think we're looking for Jared or waiting on Jared.
gotcha. Did he say he was walking back?
I
I
believe
don't
he.
have his number saved, to be
Let me
honest.
see. Yeah, walking back from class may be a little late.
Yeah. Okay. Do you guys just wanna what? You guys wanna wait till like 11:10?
I'm cool with whatever, yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Should we
Yeah.
just start?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was about to say we can go ahead and start. Let's see.
Do
So
you
I
want
think
to
we have
read?
to do, was it the introduction, right? Say our names.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm still out of it today.
No, you're all good. My name's Hunter.
My name is Amari.
I'm Alex.
I'm Ryan.
Gotcha. Okay. So the podcast mentions a number of misperceptions that people tend to hold when they think about Washington, D.C. What are some of those misperceptions, and why do the people featured in the podcast think that those misunderstandings negatively impact their fight for statehood?
So with that, I quoted from episode 1. I mentioned Adina Williams, a Washington native. She kind of brings up how people not from Washington usually envision the state filled with a bunch of politicians, lobbyists, or just protesters who fill the streets. This misconception, of course, negatively affects the fight for statehood just because it kind of sanitizes the area. It doesn't provide any history or kind of cultural context that is DC itself. There's actual people living there. Um, so that kind of misconception of it just being kind of a federally filled place, um, oh, sorry, can just, I don't know, it harms people, really.
Yeah. I said some similar to that in one of my answers with this was in episode 6, I think they interviewed one guy, and he was basically saying the same thing. Like he thought that everybody that was in DC was just a federal worker. And I mean, like it is a federal market. I actually kind of looked into it a little bit. It's like I think 28% of the jobs are all federal jobs, which is a pretty sizable amount. But I think that misconception does play a big role in people not wanting to grant them statehood because they just think it's going to be a federal market and then it should just be under federal control.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of goes into the point I was going to make about like the tax levels that people in DC play. Like I think it was episode 1 they said that like DC pays more taxes than like half of the states in the United States. And so it just kind of like shows that like although there's a lot of people in these federal job markets, like the surrounding area is still, paying a lot of taxes. They're still doing their part for like the country, so it doesn't really make sense why most people I feel like wouldn't think that.
Yeah.
Yeah. For my answer, I kind of said all of that, but I want to touch on how in episode 6, like they kept like beaming down the term like responsible and how like DC just isn't responsible enough. Which is contradictory to itself, with Marion, I think it's Barry was his last name.
Mhm.
He made the point. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Uh, he made the point of like if we had control over our neighborhoods and they wouldn't look like shit or whatever. I forget what he said exactly, but like, it's the point of them not being responsible, but at the same time, they're not really given the chance to be responsible.
Yeah, I put that as like my second biggest answer. It was kind of talking about how DC residents can't really do a whole lot to change what they need. Like they have to rely on everyone else. And I think that was like a big point in episode 2, and how like
Yeah.
they're not really allowed to advocate for themselves through legislation or through any of the processes that other states are allowed to.
Yeah, I kind of touched on that too, and I relied back on it was episode 2 and 6 with the was it Alexander Shepard, like kind of like the overarching incompetence that I think a lot of people think that DC has, where it's kind of he like pushed them into a large amount of debt, kind of indebted the city back to the federal government. But yeah, I think that's a misperception that DC residents really like can't handle their finances or have the responsibility to self-govern. And they kind of mentioned it numerous times across the podcast and referencing back to like Congress and politicians saying that as well. That was like a big thing.
Do we all want to move on to the next second part?
Yeah.
I'm a text Jared, by the way.
Um, so when did you think about Washington, D.C.? Did you operate under any of the misperceptions that are discussed in the podcast? Um, I just said honestly no. From my understanding, I thought personally that all places that kind of had people living in there had the same kind of basic state rights, at least. Like, I know everything kind of varies state from state, but I thought at least in like my own kind of juvenile way, all places had statehood. Um, so it did shock me. Literally being in this class, I'm learning so much about just what's going on within America when it comes to like elections and just kind of the different legislations that are legislations and rights that people halfway across the country have and others don't have. So it's interesting.
Yeah. I was kind of saying like in the same sense, I was like, not really. I mean, like I lived around the DC area. I was probably about like 30 minutes out, and so like I was kind of routinely in DC for a little bit. Like honestly, like with the federal market, like we were talking about, I mean, like if any of you guys have like went to DC, like you know that most places around there, it's not like a federal thing. Like they have the was it like Georgetown area, like all that stuff. Like there's a bunch of shopping, a bunch of different markets there. Um, but I think after like listening to it, I think some of the perceptions that I have of the city now have kind of changed about like the fight for statehood and the representation issues that they kind of face.
Yeah, I agree. I said like I didn't grow up near DC. I was probably like an hour and a half away. So but not too far. But I just said that like I didn't know that they didn't have any like representatives or anything. And I talked about the shadow senator that was mentioned. I think that was episode 4, where he kind of
Yeah,
just has to like go and like hope people listen to him. And it's just
yeah,
like I feel like it's a really good representation of like what DC is kind of going through um in this whole process.
Yeah, one thing I added was like, of course, I didn't really necessarily know that it was to the extreme that DC was. Like the shit that they got going on, I didn't know it was like that extreme. The only like misperception that I did operate under was I did notice like the homeless rate was insane, at least compared to Richmond, at least. That's the only city I've really been around, other than like DC. But I don't know, that was alarming to me, but that was the only thing that really like set off and like reminded me of the some of the bullshit that the opposing side would bring up.
yeah. I'll honestly say I think I kind of fell into that as well because like the safety of DC has always really been an issue, and I've kind of
Mm,
always been like, well, why don't they just like fix it, you know? But I mean, again, it's like under federal control, and Congress kind of determines their like destiny with all of this stuff. So I guess that was probably a misconception that I had, like, why won't they just like fix the issues, you know?
right.
We all ready to move on? Yeah.
Jared, we're on the second part of, is it the first question? If you want to like chime in real quick.
Um, I I think I had some the same misperceptions as you did of like just kind of like why don't they fix it? But I guess it's kind of because I was born in DC, but I didn't like live there my whole life. But I have a lot of family there, and I'm always like there and back a lot. But I just also never really like realized how bad it was, like how like out of control that they really were.
Um, I can read the next one if y'all don't mind. How much thought had you given to the issue of DC statehood before listening to the podcast? How do you feel you'd feel if you were a resident in DC? Um, I guess I'll start. Again, I didn't know that this problem was this extreme, and obviously I'd be pretty like disappointed and felt like neglected almost. So,
Yeah, no, I said the exact same thing. I was like, before listening to the podcast, I never gave DC statehood any thought really. Because like I said, I thought DC was already a state in itself, and I thought its citizens had their full state rights. Um, if I was like a DC resident, I would rightfully feel frustrated and dissatisfied. Like essentially, I kind of have no voice on anything when it comes to kind of like um locally um when it comes to like anything kind of evolving the community in a sense. So like and I'm gonna already answer this in a future question, but like for example, how they wanted to use their local funds for like a clean needle policy thing, and Congress just swooped in and stopped it. So like essentially, if there's anything that me as a resident want to like get involved in and get passed, it really doesn't matter because if Congress doesn't like it, they're just gonna put a halt on it. So I would feel frustrated. I would feel angry, honestly.
Yeah, I said pretty much the same thing. Just saying, especially when I found out they like had some voting rights and then they kind of got taken away. Like that would just be like the point where it's like, if we already did this, why are we trying to like argue with it being reinstated when it makes sense?
Yeah, I was around the same area with that. I didn't really put too much thought about DC statehood like before listening to the podcast, but I know because I lived in Maryland, like just outside the city for a while. But like a lot of people that I knew, they would travel, like they would live outside the city, like they once had lived in DC and just kind of like moved out because they didn't like the city. And so I guess like my feeling with like being a DC resident is that in some ways, if like one of you, I forgot who was saying it, but with like Congress not wanting to pass legislation, it's just like just move out of the city then, you know.
Um, I didn't give it much thought either. Like I said, despite being back and forth to DC and having a lot of like Washingtonian family members, I don't really hear. I've like never heard them bring this up at all. So I really never thought about this before this, honestly. And I would be pissed if I was a resident.
Hmm.
All right. Next question. What sorts of arguments were used during the founding era of the U.S. history to justify the decision to locate capital in Washington, D.C. and to create it as a non-state? Um, I touched a tad on the Organic Act and how that was meant to like mesh those territories, but it left DC to be, you know, at the hands of the government, and it didn't necessarily leave them with any control. Um, and of course, that progressed when the black population kind of not take didn't take over DC, but that was like the prominent like I guess that's what they were known for some reason. Like during the Voting Rights Act, they were like hating on them and really trying to suppress them with things that they couldn't control, even though like, I touched on earlier about the responsibility, but not really giving a chance to be responsible. Um, but yeah, the Organic Act, that's what I touched on.
Nice, nice, nice. I referenced episode 2, and I kind of talked about what happened in 1783 with the troops of soldiers. They were marching to Pennsylvania to commit a demonstration against Congress, and then when Hamilton asked the Pennsylvania government for protection, they were denied. So this kind of did like a snowball effect, and this created a fear for Congress that residents in any state that they resided in may kind of hold their own insurrection against Congress. So the use that as like a future fear and justification um to create a place to where they had kind of the ultimate say so in power, hence District of Columbia being kind of born and created. Um so that was kind of like what I said for the at least justification. And the decision to locate it in Washington, DC, I okay, so I guess let me ask a very, 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 very silly question. Washington was already there, right? Before District of Columbia, or are they like just synonymous with each other? And when that was created, Washington was also created.
I
Like,
believe it was so it was like quote unquote a compromise between like Maryland, Virginia to kind of like
yeah.
surrender pieces of the land with everything, which I guess this kind of goes into like my part with this because it was like the issue during this time too, because like states' rights were such a big thing, with like the 10th Amendment.
Mhm.
And it was like how does the federal government like have certain areas under federal control with independent states, you know? And that was kind of touching on like what you were talking about with the protesters kind of coming in. Because it was like, I guess the federal government in some way wanted an area that they can kind of like protect themselves and not paralyze themselves from the people. Um, so that was kind of like surrounding debate that would then uh, I guess it would be debate going into like later, like Supreme Court decisions, legislation being passed, where it's like, how does the federal government like declare certain areas under federal control, I guess, or like force states to act in some way.
Yeah, I agreed with the point about fear. Like that was kind of my main point, like how they just, they're still figuring out their government, so they needed something like you guys were saying, a safe zone. But I also think it kind of like went the other way around too. Like states needed a place where they knew that the national government was so that they could kind of stay together and not be as separated. So I think that might have come with why it was in the middle, but I know there are like other reasons why, but it kind of makes sense based on like where the other states were. And I think they talked about that in episode 2.
Oh my God, wait, that does make sense too, because around that time we only really had states on the East Coast. We didn't really expand. Okay, now you see things are being connected. Okay.
Are we ready to
Um,
move on to the next one?
Or
Yeah.
does anyone still have any thoughts? No? Okay.
Okay.
Not, no, no, not really. I think it's funny that they did that to protect themselves from protest, and then it just backfired.
Yeah.
Yeah, it ended up just fucking them over.
Okay. Well, I guess the second part of question 2, how has the decision to create DC as a non-state impacted the people living in the city, both historically and in more modern and or current politics? Use specific examples of real-world events and or policy to highlight the impact that this decision has on residents of DC.
I talked
Um,
about kind of going off your point, Jared, like how the protests kind of got brought back to them, like after they were like, nah, we don't want to be protested. And I talked about
yeah,
the
I'll
mental
say too.
hmm Go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say exactly just like the protest. Like it's just they did it for protection from that, and all it did was just make things worse, just harder to protect them.
Yeah, I talked about like the legal system too, how like I
Mhm.
think there was a story about a teenager who like killed someone when he was like 17 or 16 and he got sent to like federal prison like far away from his family. And it's just like shows how like not having like a state-run like prison system can like really lead to like some lasting issues for people who did stuff when they were younger. And how that kind of goes in with like the issue with George Floyd and like the officer being charged. It had like the same kind of implications.
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
yeah. I spoke on like episode 5 where they talked about how like the hate crime arrest didn't turn into prosecutions due to like, appointed attorneys. I thought that was super interesting. It's something I never really thought of. Like, it seems so unfair. And I feel like I take my shit for granted. Like after hearing that, especially.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I kind of, oh,
Mhm.
my
No,
bad.
no, go on. I'm talking too
Oh,
much. Go
no, I was gonna say, I was, I guess, in the same sense that you guys were with like the little control over what happens where they live, so they're kind of different in that way from states. But the biggest thing that I took away from it was the denial of the COVID-19 funding from the federal government. I think they discussed that in episode 5, I believe, along with the prison shipping with the states. And I guess it's just a way of like Congress to keep like some type of control, over the area. But again, it's like really hindering the people that live there because then they don't have the same, I guess, sort of representation, the same sort of rights, the same sort of resources that other states around them or even the country have.
on. I didn't realize there was a lot of really good examples in the podcast when it came to that. So I kind of just or I guess maybe something that caught my attention was in episode 4. And I brought it up earlier, how DC residents voted to use their local funds for that needle exchange program. And that was a policy that they wanted to implement, and Congress decided to negate that and barred DC from using its own money. And it was also notated that in any other state, Congress has absolutely like no right to do that. So DC being a non-state, that is just one of the big ways that it impacts people. Like the decisions that they want to do just cannot happen because of Congress most of the time.
Yeah. Going
Yeah,
off of
I
that
think that.
too, there was
Go ahead.
oh, my bad. No, there was the what is it with the marijuana legislation being passed by Congress, whereas like they
Mhm.
were kind of like dragging their feet to like actually pass the legislation. And then they didn't even like what they didn't publish the vote count in any
Yeah.
way, and then just kind of like dragged out the process for way too long. And then once they finally did like implement it for the DC residents, they put the stipulation that they can't actually make revenue off of the sale. So it has to be that gift exchange type of shit.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
crazy.
and all of that tax
Yeah,
money doesn't go to DC residents, so they're losing like out on so much stuff that their economy is based out of, and it goes back to like that I think you said 28% federal job market. Like they don't really the people that live there who are in the federal government don't have to worry about COVID funding or anything like that. Like they will get the COVID vaccine just through their job. And so that I think that kind of just shows how like being outside of that federal like job market can really put you at like a disadvantage in DC, and it kind of leaves you out to dry a little bit.
Do we all want to move on to question three?
yeah.
Okay. One of the things that can make debating DC statehood fraught with conflict are the assumptions that each side makes about the motives of people who disagree with him. For example, the podcast discusses the Republican assertion that Democrats' support for DC statehood is merely a power grab, not a principled stand. What do you make of that assertion?
I'll use the language that the what's it call it? The little reading guide made us do. It wasn't compelling at all because of I don't know, like DC just wants to be fair and they want equal representation. Obviously it's not fair, so it's like arguing with a toddler at this point. And anything can be a power grab. If that's what a power grab is, then okay, then everything's a power grab. Um, I don't know. It's kind of funny how there's an obvious like imbalance, but if you name call these programs and these things that DC's trying to do, then it's a shit show.
Yeah, I talked about I felt like it was the same kind of argument that like Republicans don't want the Electoral College to be removed just because like you really if you're look at the maps, any like center of population for the most part in a city is going to be more liberal than right-winged. And so like keeping those areas out of voting, especially when they would have so much power because that really make up the entire state, like it would really, I think, put them at a disadvantage. And then I also talked about how like I think it mentioned in episode 5 that incarcerated individuals in DC can vote. And so like I feel like that's a principle that a lot of Republicans would probably not go for. And so it kind of makes sense why they would continue to advocate that DC statehood is like a power grab for Democrats because they can kind of shoot for specific niches of voters.
I actually, so in my answer here, like I said, like I hated to defend this point, but like in some way, I felt like I kind of had to agree with it. Not fully, because like for the points that you guys were kind of saying, where it's like, yeah, the issue's about representation. But the main thing that kind of stood out for me from the podcast was that like previously before when I guess majorities in Congress weren't so slim, like there was big majorities on either side and it was kind of flipping all the time. Democrats and Republicans didn't really care too much about this issue. I mean, like yeah, like Lyndon B. Johnson kind of gave like the little bit of autonomy to the place, but it was like nowhere even close to granting like DC like any sort of statehood. But I think like now in a time when partisan politics is, or I guess like the majority in Congress is like so slim, I think it's pretty compelling to kind of say that giving DC that would kind of give a little bit more of an edge, and kind of steer the majority a little bit farther. And then also too, like some of the steps that I think uh advocates for DC statehood have kind of taken, it's kind of like moving away from like the amending process of the Constitution. It's kind of like intruding on like that Article 1 authority that Congress does, or the federal government does have over the area. So I mean, like I agree that it's in that sense because like no one really cared about it until recently in Congress. But then I don't know. It's a hard hill to kind of die on because you have like representation kind of on that other side.
I think it's a very nuanced topic, honestly. With because I feel like with anything in politics, even the right for DC statehood, there's winners and losers. Um, so I can understand from a Republican standpoint, um, they don't want to have more people on the opposing side, that being more Democrats if DC got statehood. However, like just on kind of the ethics, I guess, kind of morality side of it, you have these citizens that are living in a place where they don't have state rights, they don't really have a voice in any kind of community legislation that is passed. So in a way, it's sort of kind of just it's limiting, I guess. It's not giving these US American citizens their full kind of citizen power, for lack of words. I don't know. Um, but yeah, it's just it's really whichever way you want to take it, I guess.
Yeah, and I like
Mhm.
totally agree with that too, because it's like the representation issue, like that's part of a functioning democracy as we've touched across like with every assignment in this class. And that's like a big issue for giving them statehood. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm like not trying to give DC statehood in any way, but in some ways from the podcast, I kind of did see the argument that Republicans did have, and I felt like I wanted to kind of address it or at least acknowledge it in some way.
Yeah, I kind of agreed that it was a power grab, but like just not in like a bad way. I just was like, Democrats are usually just finding people who want rights, and then they're like, we're gonna represent you. I mean, like that's kind of like their thing. So I was like, yeah, it's a power grab, but that's just how the party is. Like we represent people. We represent people who need like it's not really their fault that the Republicans don't want to do that.
Right.
Yeah,
So
it's like power grab is so negative for, but I don't. It's not.
yeah,
It's how it
it's like
works.
what are we gonna do? Not represent people?
Like yeah. So I don't know.
Do we want to move on to the second part? A similar example in the podcast is Democrats' own assertion. Oh, blah. A similar example in the podcast is that Democrats' own assertion that Republican opposition to DC statehood is a racist attempt to maintain their political advantage. What do you make of that assertion? Okay, well, I said at least for that part. I do think there's some validity to that statement. DC being I said majorly, but majority Black city, whilst also being the capital of the United States, seemed to leave people kind of uncomfortable with that notion. Um, I can s- yeah, leave people uncomfortable with that notion, like um I don't know. I'm just gonna stick to what I wrote down because my mind is being weird right now. Um, I can see a non-racist standpoint being made though, because of what has been put in the Constitution. Congress does have the right to make DC a non-state place, for it to be federally controlled. Um, but over time, I feel as though many of the excuses against statehood stem kind of from a racist standpoint. Like I said, DC is a majority Black city from what I was told in the podcast. So imagine that um being like the case while also the entire world sees DC as like just the capital of United States. I feel
Mhm.
like some people don't really want those two things connecting a bit. But that's just my thought process on the whole thing.
No,
Oh yeah.
I agree with you completely. Like I said basically the same thing, that I think it like stemmed out of a racist like lens, and then after that it's like you can kind of argue that it's not. And I feel like it's hard to kind of come up with proof that something is racist or not racist, but like the way it started out, it's like obviously it had something to do with race. It's not just like a random coincidence.
Yeah, I said all of that, of course. More specifically, I said that there were microaggression like remarks. And that's what like kind of made me believe, okay, this is racist. Figures like, Nixon saying they're not accountable enough. Let me quote this. Episode 3. So like Nixon was like saying, they're not accountable enough, so there's no reason for this. I've I should have wrote down like what exactly it was, but I remember hearing the term hug a thug, and I remember
Oh
watching like
yeah, 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 yeah.
of like that was that DC's like drug program to like intervene and make like cleaner like
Yeah, it was in a episode. I wrote it down for like in the assignments that we had during the week. It was like the Hug-a-Thug was like DC self-governance was lacking, and they weren't doing enough to control like their own safety.
right. Yeah, I really wanted to make sure we said that in the discussion because I think that's just it's insane to like call it something like that. I mean, I don't even want to talk about it, but I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I was in the same boat with kind of you guys with that. Like I think previously for a while, really up until like Nixon with everything, I think yeah, it was definitely a racial issue to deny like a predominantly minority area autonomy over its own city. But I think kind of as we've moved over into more of the modern times, uh, again, like I think Alex, I think you were saying like it's kind of hard to like say that it like stems from that. But in some ways, like I think the priorities of the city and maybe like the past out of like some of the autonomy that they have been given, like that is like I guess like a Republican opposition to it, you know? Like kind of how we were talking about like the Shepherd with like putting the city in debt once they kind of had a little bit of autonomy. And then like I guess like the weed issue, I mean I could see an argument that like we wouldn't want that in the capital of the country, you know, like that to be like a big thing to like get past.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
It's interesting that they like claim that drugs are like such a big problem and then don't, like you said, they don't give them the funding they need to provide clean needles for people so that they're not having overdoses or spreading of STDs or anything like that. And like the weed issue too, like I already said, like you could use that for tax money so that these people could have more money to, work for the things they do. Cause like I feel like it doesn't mention it like necessarily, but like grassroots is like really the only way to like really get change, like protesting and stuff like that, especially with the lack of like um I mean representation, obviously. And I talked about I think they mentioned that there was like a black mayor for DC, and I feel like that kind of really sparked a lot of disagreement. I think that was episode 2 or 3 where they said that. And then they kind of went on like a while of why like it had become a racial issue and how other states had kind of gone through the same thing. I think they mentioned like Alaska, and another state that were going through the same thing.
Yeah, I think they mentioned what was it? I think it was like Indiana, Louisiana, and Alaska with some like with just like perpetuating problems that like it like reflects what DC kind of has as well. And it's like, well, they're states. It's like, why can't you give me statehood? You know? So
Jared, do you have any thoughts before we move on?
Um, Not really. I agree with you guys that there's definitely a lot of racist undertone to it, and there's a lot of racist as like intertwined into the whole thing. But I think mostly, at least nowadays, it's really just like a power grab thing. Like everything's so close, the Senate's so close. There's so many like flip back and forth, and everything's so here and there that it's kind of just like we're not just going to give you more power because we're not even sure about ours.
Right. Okay. Um, so I don't even know if that's a new question, but anyways, so talk to some friends and family about this debate. Based on what you hear, is the assumption that the issue breaks down neatly across partisan lines, Democrats equal support, Republicans equal opposition, and and oversimplification, or does it seem to accurately reflect attitudes on the topic of DC statehood? Were there any additional points made when talking to other people about the topic that the podcast didn't touch on?
Um, I just talked to my roommates. They basically just they weren't necessarily too like they're on the same level of knowledge that I was going into this. Like they didn't know this existed, but once I like explained it in like a non-biased way, I just like said like um they were fighting for a while, didn't get it, and then like these remarks were thrown around, and now it's a power grab. Um, they agreed. They didn't really have anything else to say. Uh, I don't know if that's whether they cared or not, but that's just what happened.
No, I kind of had the same kind of response. I asked like a few of my friends and like my girlfriend about it, and they were just like, I don't know, like, okay, like why statehood? Like I don't really care too much. Um, I don't know. I don't think there's probably enough information or enough people really talking about it at like the national level for it to be like a big issue for people to kind of like have. And then too, like most people that I've like talked about, which was kind of referenced in like episode 6 and 2, was that a lot of people that I talked to, like they still just think that DC is like a federal job market, you know? And they're like, well, I mean, if it's under federal control, it's like, why not just have like federal jobs?
Yeah, I mentioned pretty much the same thing. I said, like, I talked a little bit to my family, but they're kind of like uninvolved in a lot of things. And then most of my friends just like didn't know about the DC voting issue. And so it was kind of interesting to like see how like a lot of people are uneducated. I feel like on both sides, because like half my family is definitely on the right and they still had no fucking idea. So I don't know how much it is like. I feel like anytime there's an issue, people will just jump on one side and start arguing despite, not knowing what is going on. And I feel like this was one of those instances.
Yeah. I know I talked to my roommates, and I think I talked to a neighbor while I was just doing a walk. Um, and we both kind of agreed that well, at least I said for the first part that historically, um, I don't, I said I don't think historically it neatly broke down this way. However, in recent years, and this is where me and my neighbor kind of agreed on, that majority of the opposition between the two, um, are just because one party agrees and one party disagrees. So it's like as long as Democrats are in favor for it, then everyone that identifies as Democrats are going to be in favor for it. And then as long as Republicans are against it, then it doesn't really matter kind of the facts or feelings or whatever. Republicans are just going to be against it. I think that kind of involves I think that kind of just follows the recent trend of the high polarization that we have nowadays. Like I said, a lot of things include nuance, and because everything is so you versus me, I'm just gonna like no matter what stick to my side, even if it leans more towards like if your own personal viewpoints lean more towards Republican or Democrats. So yeah, that's what I said.
Also, like another thing I did forget to kind of mention in my response with this was that some of the people that I did talk to, they mentioned the 13th, which we talked about in class, which was like that prison documentary with like the modern day slavery. A lot of people, when I was talking about it, I was talking about the prison, like kind of like cycling them out of state to go to places. A few of them had mentioned that, where like that's definitely like an issue that they would like to see resolved with that. And it definitely wasn't on partisan lines at all. Like it was Democrats and Republicans were both agreeing with that, where it's like, yeah, that seems kind of like it's depriving them of like, I guess, like a liberty in some way, like
Mhm.
procedural due process. So I don't know.
I had no good conversations with anybody about this. Not a lot of people I asked were very well educated in it though, but a lot of them agreed with things like also like the prison. They should like at least have control over budget. Like basic things, but like they weren't that like well versed to so much.
Right. And that makes sense. I feel like even as we're in this class, a lot of us didn't really think about DC statehood. So I wouldn't expect people, just random people in our lives to know about it either. So that makes
Yeah.
sense. Um, do we want to move on to the next part? Okay. Um, Overall, what arguments in the podcast did you find most compelling in favor of DC statehood, or at least compelling in opposition to DC statehood?
Um, I can go. The prison system, just control over the prison system. Like you said, just like prisoners being thrown immediately into the federal system, um, and just be thrown around. I had also mentioned, I think Hunter brought it up, the story about the guy who killed someone when he was younger, and then just spent his whole life really just honestly just struggling to like fit into the prison system and the people around him, and just seeing his family. So that was probably like one of the most compelling stories to me. It's just the control of the prison.
Yeah, I kind of had the same, I guess, answer with that. I think the prison issue is definitely concerning, and it does limit at least DC in the rehabilitation of prisoners, and is kind of depriving them of a normal experience which other prisoners would be able to have. In some ways as well, I could probably say that the federal government, by having this like out of state cycling with prisoners, as really depriving them of like due process and at least some liberties that are kind of outlined in the Constitution, which is counterintuitive to most of the Republican claims, where Democrats probably aren't following constitutional norms or rules in trying to grant DC statehood, when the federal government really isn't even providing DC residents proper like constitutional rights. And another thing, I guess, going with that as well is representation. That's just like the biggest one. I mean, it was episode one, and then the prison one was episode five. But episode one, they kind of talk. It's like it's essential to a functioning democracy, you know. And like without the ability to elect representatives, you're essentially denying portions of the population like a say in where the direction of the country is going, you know.
I agreed pretty much. I feel like there were like a few like really compelling ones, and then the rest were kind of just like extra information that kind of just like swayed me a little bit. I again just brought up in episode 4 where they talked about how voting rights had already been a thing, and how it never really makes sense to me to take rights away from a place, especially when it's already been done. Like I feel like if we've already done it once, it would be pretty easy to just come together and decide to do something.
Yeah, I basically just talked about like the fact that they're being taxed and they serve in military. Those are my biggest things. Episode 6 especially talked about the military issue. That's just crazy to me, like serving a country that I don't really necessarily have like a vote in.
Yeah.
Confused me.
Um, I kind of said I found just I said I found it compelling. What did I even write? The main argument I found compelling in favor of DC statehood is allowing residents who live there to make decisions regarding the environment they live in. I do think it's unfortunate that policies and legislation that gets passed in DC receive no heft or weight from the people who live there. So I didn't really like specify one clear example. I kind of just specify like the overall issue with the DC not having statehood. The residents don't really have real weight when it comes to anything that happens. Um, so I just found that to be like the most compelling argument for DC statehood. Um, do we want to move on to the second part?
Yeah.
What arguments in the podcast did you find the least compelling in favor of DC statehood, or most compelling in opposition to DC statehood?
I thought I guess the past, as we've kind of, or at least I've mentioned in some of the responses, like episode two, they were talking about Shepard, where then they were given like some sort of autonomy in the city, and then it kind of just sent DC in the debt, and then back to the federal government with like handling finances and having like some control. I think that is I guess, a compelling argument in opposition of it. and two, I guess the priorities maybe of the city, you know? Like we were talking about the marijuana legislation, but in some ways I would understand why the federal government maybe wouldn't want that at the Capitol. You know, you might be like bringing in the wrong crowd or at least having high traffic into there. Because I know once that passed, a lot of people from Virginia and Maryland started kind of going to DC to just like buy weed and then come back out, you know,
Yeah.
Mhm.
where it's like then it's like a lot of high traffic going into there with maybe not the right crowd you want in, I don't know, like the capital, you know. So
Yeah. I spoke more towards like I think it was episode 5 for my most compelling argument to be opposed to the DC statehood issue. Was a solution that they suggested, like merging DC with Maryland. Um, I didn't really have an opinion on it. I thought it was pretty neutral. I thought it was a decent idea. Just I guess to shut DC up in a sense because it's not necessarily addressing the issue that they've been going through. It's not acknowledging that it's a terrible thing. It's more so like here, just go with your neighbors and shit like that. So, um, I found that the most compelling solution.
Nice, nice. Um, So for mine, I did give this one a little meat. I said an argument I found the least compelling in opposition to statehood was the one made in episode 4 and 6. Congressmen against statehood believe that because of some of the decisions made by DC's local officials, they haven't earned the right to have statehood. Um, I found it profoundly worrisome, and in my opinion, at least, just a tad bit evil to deny citizens the right to have state autonomy because of how you perceive kind of the state, kind of how they're running the city when they do have their own autonomy, for lack of better words. I also found it kind of having no basis in reality, considering how many issues occur in other countless states. Like, they brought up Kojo Namdi, I don't know how to say his last name, but Kojo. He brought up how I think in Ohio or something, officials were doing drugs and everything and all of that, and their statehood wasn't stripped from them or anything like that. Like it's really a non-starter issue just because things are gonna happen in whatever state. Like saying I don't think you've earned the right to have your own autonomy as a state just because of some of the things that you've done in the past. It's it's flimsy at best.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I said that the most compelling one for me was by the founders being just scared of a too strong of a national government. I feel like it obviously doesn't have any stake now, but out of all of the arguments they had, I felt like that one had the most precedent because of they were still growing as a country.
Mhm.
I think that was just in episode 1. And how I also talked about how like the jailing issue, like it felt compelling, but not in the way of like whether we should have DC statehood or not, just because I feel like it kind of points out that there's a flaw in the system and not necessarily like in a geographical location. And I think DC kind of just exemplifies that issue. So I just said it was like not as compelling in the lens of thinking about DC statehood. And I think that was episode 5.
Slay.
I I wrote about the same thing like drugs, like Hunter, and like just inviting the wrong crowd. I just spoke a little bit more into like it might create like a black market type of thing because you know like in like places where like Chicago's biggest gun issue is the fact that guns come out of state and stuff like that. So I guess you could also see that being an issue is like, oh, well, our biggest supplier of illegal weed in other states is our state capital. So I can see how that just would just not be a thing you would want, especially in America, who's supposed to be like the best.
I agree with literally everything that you all said. So yeah. Um, so I guess the final question. Using information from the Last Week Tonight episode on U.S. territories, in what ways, if any, do your opinions about granting or not granting statehood to DC extend to the debate over Puerto Rican statehood? Be specific and explain why/where you see similarities and differences between the two debates, and how those thoughts and feelings shape your overall support or opposition to statehood for Puerto Rico and potentially any other territories.
I said it translated like not really a lot for me. Like I don't really see it as in the same light. And like I said that if Puerto Rico had to remain in like the United States kind of control, then I would want it to be a state. But overall, I would rather the US like slowly let go of it and let it like do its own thing. Which it talked about in the last week Tonight Show. I don't exactly.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like if they want to be a state, make them a state. But also at the same, I've also seen like they a lot of, I don't know, maybe I just got the wrong perception, but a lot of them kind of see themselves as like Americans, and I feel like there's a big group of people in Puerto Rico that would want to be a state, especially because of just how long they just been like treated terribly by the US and just how that's like what that's done to them. So it's at a point where it's like, well, now you should fix it. And so, I mean, if they want a state, I think they should become a state. But at the same time, it's really what they want.
Yeah.
Agreed.
To add on that, I kind of spoke towards like the similarity being that both of these territories have been like villainized by our government. Kind of like a gaslighting type of vibe. Like, no, you're not supposed to be here. Da, 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 but like, there's obviously like connections and cultural ties that America has with Puerto Rico and America obviously has with DC. So like, to deny them the statehood was kind of odd to me, for Puerto Rico's sense at least. I also talked about like I just start spewing like similarities of like majority minority populations being villainized by like our what US government. So that's what I took away from it.
I think DC statehood, and at least with the other territories, I think it's going to be a lot more manageable for granting the other territories besides DC statehood. I mean, for like one, I mean, like they don't serve as the capital of the United States, and I think that would just make it a way more easier argument for granting statehood as compared to DC. And then also, it's like these territories aren't really built upon like foundational norms in the Constitution to like protect the capital and allow the federal government to regulate some area for security. You know, as we kind of talked about with like the founders' intent with all of it. And then also too, like there's Supreme Court decisions and precedent that has been established that the arrangements that we made on these outside territories were only supposed to be for a temporary amount of time, which I think could potentially signal to at least Congress, the executive, and the judicial branch to kind of pass or get something done with granting them statehood or at least like full representation, you know, because like as they kind of even pointed out with the Guam, or no, was it not Guam, I think. It was what 1/8 of the island served our country, and like 44% of it was like
Yeah, I think that
military,
was
but then they had
Guam.
like the highest amount of like they're far exceeding the voting turnout percentages as compared to like the mainland. So it's like I feel like there's really good interest in like the federal government extending statehood to this and like not denying it as compared to like DC.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I kind of said something similar, I guess. So I see like kind of similarities between the two when it comes to representation in Congress. I know a guy spoke to Congress when he went up to for Puerto Rico, and he was kind of speaking about representation that kind of followed the same vein on how DC doesn't have representation in Congress. Um I said I said one difference is that residents of DC get to vote in the federal elections. But that's all. Um, I think Puerto Rico and any other United States territory should be a state if they want to. Because like in my eyes, at least, what's the point of making residents American citizens if they don't receive any of those rights associated with being one? Um, And then also Congress already, oh yeah, and then I said exactly what you said, Hunter, for the last bit. I said also Congress already inhabits an area, so the excuse for not making DC a state does not apply to any other territory. Um, so like I know Guam, Puerto Rico, and I think American Samoas. I want to say I feel like I'm forgetting another territory. But like from at least from what I've seen with the John Oliver show, all of them seem to want to be officially like um within the American fabric. At least it's just America isn't giving them the time of day. So I don't know, it's interesting, but then also kind of calls into question um if all of them becomes if all of them become states, how would that kind of, I guess, affect Congress? Would it throw it off? Like Democrats, Republican type of way? I don't know. I think
I
I'm
kind
just
of talked
yeah, but
I talked about that a little bit. I said that like if anything, it would make it better because I don't understand why we have a bunch of even number like representation like chambers. Like it doesn't make sense to have 100 exactly because it's just going to lead to that issue of like 50 versus 50.
right.
And also talked about how like Puerto Rico is a little bit different than like DC, with like the climate like an environmental crisis they face, and like they never receive the right amount of funding. They're like the last hurricane took like years just to get power back in some places, and it's like if we're gonna claim that we're protecting or having some control over these places, they need to have a place to advocate for the aid and need they need, especially when they pay taxes and stuff.
Right.
I think too, like if these issues by some of these territories got more national coverage in some way, I think it would kind of coerce Congress into doing something about it and making it a state, or maybe just allowing it to do its own thing in some way, you know?
Yeah.
But like they were talking about I think it was the John Oliver one, but with Guam, I believe, whereas like one eighth of the population served in the military, and they have a huge veteran population. But then like per capita, they like ranked, what was it? It was like $850 or something like that, like spent on veterans, which was like $2,000 less than the next one above it. And it's like that's absolutely disgusting for a place where like I guess more people are serving in the military as compared to like the mainland, like per state. And like they're getting like the least amount of like I guess coverage. Like they were talking about some dude had to travel like 200 miles to get to a VA clinic to like
Mhm.
help with like PTSD and all that stuff. And it was just it's disgusting.
Yeah, no, it was I think something else that I was thinking about when it came to that was also like having advocacy. I know in the 51st podcast there was an idea brought up that lobbying to other people outside of DC could kind of force Congress to recognize DC as a state because all the other states are pushing back. And I was kind of like, okay, well, that could also, I think Alex brought that up, having advocacy for those states. However, I don't think a lot of people know that these places are United States territories besides Puerto Rico. I feel like Puerto Rico is talked about a lot, but like Guam, um, American Samoa, things like that. I don't think a lot of people even know those are our territories.
Yeah. Like the Virgin Islands too, they were talking about them. Like they're not even granted statehood. Like they have
Yeah.
to like earn it in some way, which is just crazy.
Like, how do you earn statehood, I guess? That's
I have no idea. I they didn't really explore too much on it with it. I know they're like born, but then like they have to like I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure what the whole process is with it all, but it was just crazy to me.
Well,
it is 12:09. We have until 12:15. So, any other thoughts, people, on anything?
Oh, really?
I think we started at like
um,
12:10, arguably, so or 11:10. So
Yeah.
I
Do
think
you
we were
guys
pretty
think
good.
do you guys think like the prison shipping between states, do you think that would like categorize as like cruel and unusual punishment?
Well, I mean, it depends on what country you look at. I just read about it was who was it? Clinton sent like a bunch of people arrested back to El Salvador, and it turned into like one of the biggest gangs in the country that are like running half of the island. So I don't know if it's cruel and unusual for like the inmates. Well, I guess in the DC one, I see that for sure.
Yeah, and the
But
DC one, you know.
it gets like kind of shifty when you start shipping people from jails just in general, especially when it's
Yeah,
like immigrants or anything like that. They're quick to send them far, far away. So
yeah.
No, I
Yeah.
never really gave much thought about that. However, I can see it as that just it kind of resembles cow herding, in my opinion. Like you're just moving just human beings to different places around the country with kind of no say. And I know like you're in prison, you don't have any like rights, but like it's insane that I went to prison in like Tennessee and now I'm all the way in Oklahoma fighting for my life.
Mhm.
Um so yeah, it's there's definitely a discussion that
Yeah.
should be brought up about that.
Yeah. I think we're all good, right?
I think so
Anyone have
too.
any other thoughts? No? Okay. Well, do we got class Thursday, right? We going
Yes.
in person? Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I think we might have a speaker. She isn't too sure, but she
Yeah,
said everyone still come to class. She also wants to talk about the course
of course you
evaluation.
know. Yeah.
all right,
Okay.
you guys.
Cool.
Yeah.
See ya.
Uh,